The judge laughed in his face. The prosecution thought he was finished. But when this black man took the courtroom by storm, he left everyone, including the judge, speechless. The courtroom was packed, rows of spectators, journalists with their notepads ready, and a jury that had already made up its mind before the first argument was even presented. At the center of it all, Jonathan Ellis sat alone at the defendant's table, adjusting his navy blue tie with steady hands. He wasn't a lawyer, not officially anyway, but he knew the law better than most of the so-called experts in the room. Judge Richard Calloway leaned back in his chair, tapping his gavel lightly against the bench, his expression one of barely contained amusement. He'd seen plenty of men like Jonathan before, men who thought they could beat the system with a few fancy words and some misplaced confidence. It never worked. "Mr. Ellis," the judge said, raising an eyebrow, "I assume you understand the risks of representing yourself in a case of this magnitude?" Jonathan nodded once, his expression unreadable. "Very well," Calloway continued, barely suppressing a smirk. "Proceed." A few quiet chuckles rippled through the prosecution's table. Adam Grayson, the assistant district attorney, exchanged glances with his co-counsel, shaking his head as if this was all a waste of time. They weren't worried. The evidence against Jonathan was, in their minds, airtight. He had been a mid-level financial consultant for Wilkes & Harrington, one of the biggest investment firms in Phoenix, Arizona. When money started disappearing, nearly $500,000, his name was all over the suspicious transactions. The firm wasted no time throwing him under the bus. His boss, Franklin Dorsey, claimed Jonathan had sole access to the accounts in question. Multiple reports suggested that fraudulent wire transfers were made from his work computer. When investigators pulled his financial records, they found unexplained deposits in an offshore account linked to his Social Security number. It was open and shut. At least, that's what they thought. Judge Calloway glanced at the jury, then back at Jonathan. "Mr. Ellis, the prosecution claims they have overwhelming evidence against you, yet, instead of hiring an attorney, you've chosen to represent yourself. I'm just curious, do you have a law degree I'm unaware of?" Another chuckle from the prosecution. Even some of the jurors looked amused. Jonathan met the judge's gaze evenly. "I don't have a law degree," he admitted, "but I know the law. More importantly, I know the truth." The laughter in the room died down. A flicker of something, annoyance, curiosity, passed through the judge's expression. "Very well," Calloway said, flipping open his notes. "Then let's hear it. The state of Arizona versus Jonathan Ellis. Prosecution, you may begin." The first witness was called, a former colleague, someone who once smiled in Jonathan's face but had no problem testifying against him. But Jonathan wasn't fazed. He had been preparing for this moment for months, but the people in that room had no idea what was coming next. The bailiff's voice echoed through the courtroom. "The prosecution calls Franklin Dorsey to the stand." Jonathan sat still, his hands folded neatly on the defense table. He had expected this. Franklin Dorsey, his former boss, was a man who had built a reputation on charisma and cutthroat ambition. The kind of executive who shook your hand with a smile while making sure there was a knife aimed at your back. Dorsey strode to the witness stand with confidence, buttoning his tailored suit as he sat. The prosecution had chosen their first witness wisely. Who better to paint Jonathan as a criminal than the very man who had once signed his paychecks? Adam Grayson, the assistant district attorney, approached with an air of satisfaction. "Mr. Dorsey," Grayson began, "how long have you known the defendant?" Dorsey cleared his throat. "About 7 years. He was one of my financial consultants." "And how would you describe his work?" "He was good, smart, meticulous, and knowledgeable about investment law." Dorsey paused, then sighed dramatically. "Which is why this was so disappointing. The prosecution was setting the stage. Get the jury to believe Jonathan was competent enough to pull off the crime, but untrustworthy enough to do it." Grayson nodded. "Can you tell us what happened when you discovered the missing funds?" Dorsey folded his hands. "We ran a standard quarterly audit. That's when we noticed the inconsistencies. Large amounts were being transferred into accounts that shouldn't have existed. We immediately launched an internal investigation and—" He turned to the jury, his voice lowering for effect. All the trails led back to Jonathan Ellis. Jonathan didn't flinch. He had heard it all before. The first time was when he was fired, unceremoniously escorted out of the building like a common thief. The second time was when the police knocked on his door with a warrant. Now, the prosecution was making sure the jury saw him exactly how they wanted. Guilty. Grayson walked toward the evidence table. Your Honor, Exhibit A. A large screen lit up with copies of bank statements showing multiple deposits to an offshore account. Grayson turned back to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, these transfers came directly from the defendant's computer. The login credentials match his employee ID and... He pointed to the bottom of the document. The recipient? An account registered to Jonathan Ellis. Low murmurs spread across the courtroom. The evidence looked solid. Even Jonathan knew that on the surface it was damning. Grayson let the silence linger before continuing. Mr. Dorsey, to your knowledge, did anyone else have access to the defendant's login credentials? No, Dorsey said without hesitation. Only Jonathan. Another pause. Another careful glance at the jury. Then Grayson delivered his final blow. And in your professional opinion, Mr. Dorsey, is there any reasonable doubt that Jonathan Ellis was the one behind these transfers? Dorsey leaned forward slightly. None whatsoever. Grayson turned to the judge. No further questions. Judge Calloway gave a slight nod. Mr. Ellis, your witness. Jonathan stood up. He buttoned his jacket, taking his time as he approached the witness stand. The energy in the room shifted just slightly. The prosecution had confidence. The jury had doubt. The judge still had amusement. But Jonathan? He had patience. He let the moment stretch before speaking. Then in a voice steady and direct, he asked, Mr. Dorsey, you said I was one of your financial consultants? Dorsey tilted his head slightly as if the question was unnecessary. Yes. And you claim I was the only one who had access to these accounts? That's correct. Jonathan nodded. He glanced at the jury. Mr. Dorsey, how many employees did Wilkes and Harrington have in their financial division? Dorsey hesitated. Roughly 50, I'd say. And how many of them had clearance for financial transactions? Another pause. This one shorter. About a dozen. Jonathan nodded again, slower this time. A dozen employees with clearance. Yet you're telling this court under oath that not one of those other employees could have accessed my login credentials? Dorsey shifted slightly in his seat. It was assigned specifically to you. Jonathan smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. You're right, it was. But let's talk about that for a second. He turned and walked a few steps, letting his words settle. Would you say most employees at your firm use their work computers daily? Dorsey frowned. Of course. And are these computers ever left unattended? Let's say during a lunch break, a meeting, a quick trip to the bathroom? Silence. Jonathan turned to the jury. Because here's the thing. I did leave my computer unattended, plenty of times, just like everyone else in that office. And anyone with half a brain could walk up, type in a few numbers, and frame me for something I didn't do. Dorsey's jaw tightened. The jury was listening, but Jonathan wasn't done yet. And what he was about to reveal next would turn this case upside down. The courtroom was silent, not the kind of silence that came from boredom or routine, but the kind that meant people were listening. The jury had stopped shifting in their seats. Even Judge Calloway, who had spent the first half of the trial half amused, half annoyed, was now watching Jonathan with actual interest. Jonathan walked back toward the defense table, picking up a thick folder. He held it up just enough for the jury to see. These, he said, tapping the cover, are copies of the company's internal security logs. Every single login activity for every employee with financial clearance. He flipped through the pages casually, then looked back at Dorsey. You said I was the only person who could have made those transfers. Dorsey nodded slowly. That's correct. Jonathan took a breath. Then he walked toward the large screen where the prosecution had proudly displayed its so-called airtight evidence. Your Honor, Jonathan said, with the court's permission, I'd like to present a timeline of login activities from the day these fraudulent transactions took place. Judge Calloway sighed, but waved his hand. Proceed. Jonathan turned toward the screen. Exhibit B. The screen lit up again, but this time with logs that hadn't been shown before. Jonathan enlarged the first timestamp, then circled it with the laser pointer. This, he said, is the time the first fraudulent transaction was made, 10:42 a.m. He clicked again, revealing another highlight on the log. And this, 10:39 a.m., the time I swiped my badge to leave the building for an off-site client meeting. A ripple of whispers spread across the room. Jonathan didn't stop. He clicked again, and another log appeared. This, he pointed, is the next fraudulent transfer, 2:17 p.m. And this? He zoomed in on another section of the records. The time I was sitting in an office across town, giving a presentation to potential investors, documented, recorded, and emailed to half the executive board. The courtroom shifted. The judge leaned forward slightly. The prosecution? Stone-faced. Grayson had stopped smiling. He knew this was bad. Jonathan wasn't done yet. He turned back to Dorsey. Mr. Dorsey, did you personally review these logs before accusing me of fraud? Dorsey hesitated, but only for a second. The IT department handled the investigation. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. So you personally never checked these? Dorsey cleared his throat. That wasn't my job. Jonathan nodded. Right, but accusing me publicly, having me arrested, and testifying under oath that I was the only person who could have made these transfers, that was your job? Dorsey opened his mouth, then shut it. Jonathan let the silence stretch before speaking again. Your Honor, I move to dismiss this case based on unreliable evidence, or at the very least, request a forensic analysis of these logins, because if we did a proper audit, we'd see exactly which computer, which IP address, and which employee credentials were used to access these accounts. Judge Calloway rubbed his temple. The amusement from earlier? Gone. Mr. Grayson, the judge said, turning toward the prosecution, any explanation for this? Grayson stood up quickly, but Jonathan could see the hesitation in his movements now. Your Honor, while the logs presented by the defense are certainly interesting, they don't necessarily exonerate him. It's possible he arranged for someone else to make these transactions on his behalf. Jonathan smiled, not because he was enjoying this, but because he knew desperation when he saw it. So now the theory is that I had a secret accomplice? He turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution spent this entire trial saying I acted alone. Now that they've been caught in their own web, they want to change the story. He let that hang in the air before delivering the final blow. But let's test their new theory. If I had an accomplice, why would I have left a paper trail leading directly to my name? Why would I use my login, my work computer, and my offshore account to steal money and get caught in the most obvious way possible? More murmurs from the jury. Jonathan turned back to Judge Calloway. Your Honor, I'd like to call a new witness to the stand. Calloway raised an eyebrow. And who would that be? Jonathan didn't hesitate. Mark Singleton. The moment the name left his mouth, Dorsey's entire face changed. And Jonathan knew, right then, he had them. Because what was about to happen next would expose the real thief. The air in the courtroom shifted. The moment Jonathan said the name Mark Singleton, something flickered across Franklin Dorsey's face. Panic. It was subtle, but Jonathan caught it, and so did the jury. Grayson, the prosecutor, quickly stood. Your Honor, the defense is attempting to introduce an unlisted witness. There's no prior disclosure of... Jonathan cut him off. Actually, Your Honor, Mark Singleton was on the original employee roster provided by the prosecution during discovery. He worked in the financial department, he had clearance to company accounts, and he left the company just 2 weeks after I was fired. Judge Calloway's gaze narrowed slightly. Mr. Ellis, are you suggesting this witness has direct knowledge of the transactions? Jonathan locked eyes with the judge. I'm suggesting he's the one who made them. Silence. The judge exhaled, clearly rethinking everything about this case. Then after a long pause, he looked at the bailiff. Bring Mark Singleton into the courtroom. A murmur spread across the room. A few reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. Even some of the jurors exchanged curious glances. This was supposed to be an easy conviction. Now, nobody knew what was about to happen. When Mark Singleton entered, his expression was neutral, maybe a little too neutral. He was a thin, wiry man in his late 40s, with graying hair and a nervous energy that he tried to keep under control. But Jonathan knew what to look for. Singleton took the stand, raised his right hand, and swore to tell the truth. Then Jonathan approached. Mr. Singleton, you worked at Wilkes & Harrington for how long? Singleton cleared his throat. 5 years. And what was your role? Financial operations. Jonathan paced a little, not because he needed to, but because it made people nervous. So you had clearance to financial transactions? Singleton hesitated. Limited access. Jonathan raised an eyebrow. Limited? Or the same access as me? Singleton blinked. The same. Jonathan nodded. Right. And what would you say if I told you that the same fraudulent transactions the prosecution is using against me were made from a computer registered under your employee ID? The entire room shifted. Singleton swallowed hard. Too hard. Objection! Grayson shot up. Your Honor, the defense is making unfounded accusations. Jonathan didn't flinch. Your Honor, if the prosecution had bothered to investigate properly, they would have seen that Mark Singleton's credentials were used for at least 2 of the transfers in question. He turned back to Singleton. So I'll ask again, do you still want to say you had limited access? Sweat formed on Singleton's forehead. He shifted in his seat. His eyes darted toward Dorsey, who sat stone-faced, not looking at him. Jonathan smirked internally. That told him everything. Singleton wasn't the mastermind. Dorsey was. Jonathan turned to Judge Calloway. Your Honor, the prosecution claims the evidence against me was airtight, but what they failed to mention is that the company logs show another employee making transactions under my credentials. He clicked the screen. A new document appeared, this time a company email record from IT security. These emails show that just 1 day before the fraudulent transactions began, an employee requested a credential reset for my work login. He turned back to Singleton. And that request came from your computer. Gasps. Singleton froze. He glanced at Grayson, then at Dorsey. Jonathan leaned in slightly. Would you like to explain that? Singleton's mouth opened, then closed. His hands trembled slightly. He knew what was happening. He knew he was trapped. Finally, he cracked. I was just following orders. His voice wavered. I didn't know what it was for at first. Dorsey told me to... Objection! Grayson practically yelled, his face turning red. Your Honor, this is hearsay! Judge Calloway held up a hand. Overruled. His tone was sharp now. He turned to Singleton. You'd better clarify that statement. Singleton's breath hitched. His hands gripped the edges of the witness stand. I was told to reset Ellis's credentials and pass them on to Mr. Dorsey. Jonathan turned to the jury. There it was. He turned back to Singleton, voice calm. So you're saying Franklin Dorsey instructed you to access my login, make unauthorized transactions, and then let me take the fall for it? Singleton exhaled shakily. Yes. The courtroom exploded. Reporters scribbled furiously. The jury looked stunned. Judge Calloway sat back, lips pressed together, deep in thought. Franklin Dorsey? Silent. Not a word. Grayson was already flipping through his notes, looking for a way to salvage this disaster. Jonathan? He just stood there, calm, composed, because he knew the game had changed, and now the judge, the jury, and even the prosecution knew the truth. But what happened next would seal the deal for good. The room erupted. Murmurs, gasps, the sound of pens scratching against notepads. The jury exchanged glances, some leaning back, arms crossed, others sitting up straight, alert. Even Judge Calloway, who had spent most of the trial bored or amused, now wore a look of genuine intrigue. But the person who mattered most? Franklin Dorsey. The man who, up until this moment, had carried himself with the calm confidence of a corporate kingpin, now sat stone-faced, eyes forward, shoulders stiff. Jonathan turned his attention back to Mark Singleton, who was still visibly shaken on the witness stand. You're saying Franklin Dorsey ordered you to reset my login credentials, access financial accounts under my name, and execute transactions that frame me for a crime I didn't commit? Singleton exhaled sharply. His hands gripped the edge of the stand, knuckles white. He was sweating now, really sweating. I didn't know what he was going to do, Singleton mumbled. I did what I was told. Jonathan pressed forward. Did you benefit from these transactions? Were you paid? A slight hesitation. Singleton swallowed hard. Not at first. Jonathan tilted his head. Not at first? Singleton's shoulders slumped. Dorsey gave me a bonus. A few weeks after you were fired. 30 grand. There it was. The jury reacted immediately. Someone let out a low whistle. One of the reporters in the back whispered something furiously into a recorder. Grayson, the prosecutor, looked like he wanted to sink into his chair, because he knew this wasn't just a defense anymore. This was a bombshell. Judge Calloway rubbed his temple, then turned to Franklin Dorsey. Mr. Dorsey, I'd like to hear from you now. Dorsey, to no one's surprise, didn't move, didn't blink, didn't acknowledge a thing. Jonathan could feel it, the shift in power. He had control of the room now, but he wasn't done yet. Jonathan walked back to the evidence screen, clicked once. A new document appeared. "These," he said, turning to the jury, "are transaction logs from the offshore account where the stolen funds ended up. Now, let's take a look at who really had access." Another click, another highlighted section. Jonathan turned, staring right at Dorsey. "Ladies and gentlemen, these transactions weren't just linked to my login. They were also linked to a second set of credentials." He paused, let the weight of his words settle, then spoke the name aloud. Franklin Dorsey. The room exploded again. Dorsey's expression barely changed, but the slight tensing of his jaw, the way his fingers curled into fists, that was enough. Jonathan turned to Judge Calloway. "Your Honor, I move for an immediate dismissal of all charges against me and recommend an investigation into Franklin Dorsey for fraud, perjury, and obstruction of justice." The judge leaned forward, elbows on his bench, studying Jonathan with a newfound respect. Calloway had laughed at him earlier, mocked him. Now, the laughter was gone. Instead, there was only consideration. And then the judge sighed. "Mr. Grayson," he said, turning toward the prosecution, "the defense has presented compelling evidence that directly contradicts the case against Mr. Ellis. Do you have any further arguments?" Grayson hesitated. He flipped through his notes, but at this point, he knew there was nothing left to say. With obvious reluctance, he cleared his throat. "The state has no further arguments, Your Honor." Jonathan kept his face neutral, but inside, he knew he'd won. But what happened next would be the moment no one saw coming. Judge Calloway leaned back in his chair. He exhaled slowly, eyes scanning the courtroom. The once smug prosecution looked deflated. The jury sat motionless, absorbing the weight of what had just unfolded. And Franklin Dorsey? He hadn't moved, not once. Not a single word of denial, not even an attempt at an explanation. Because he knew anything he said now would only bury him deeper. The judge tapped his gavel lightly, signaling for silence. The murmurs in the room faded. Then he turned his attention to Jonathan. "Mr. Ellis," he said, his voice more measured now. No laughter, no smirk. "After reviewing the evidence presented, I find that the prosecution has failed to meet the burden of proof in this case." He let that linger before continuing. "The charges against you are hereby dismissed with prejudice. You are free to go." A wave of noise rippled through the courtroom. Jonathan let out a slow breath, absorbing the moment. Not relief, certainty. He had always known the truth, but proving it, that was something else entirely. The judge wasn't finished yet. "I am also ordering an immediate investigation into Franklin Dorsey and Mark Singleton for their roles in this matter." He turned his gaze to the prosecution. "Mr. Grayson, I strongly suggest the district attorney's office reevaluate how they handle cases like this in the future." Jonathan caught the way Grayson swallowed hard. He knew what that meant. This case would haunt him. A wrongful prosecution? In a case this public? It wouldn't be long before the DA's office started looking for someone to blame. And Franklin Dorsey? He was already finished. Jonathan turned, grabbing his papers and tucking them into his folder. He took his time, not because he needed to, but because he wanted everyone in that courtroom to remember this moment. When he finally walked toward the exit, he felt eyes on him. The jury, the spectators, the reporters. And then, just as he reached the doors, Judge Calloway spoke one last time. "Mr. Ellis." Jonathan stopped. Calloway studied him for a beat. Then, with something that almost resembled reluctant respect, he nodded. "You argued your case well." Jonathan didn't smile, didn't thank him. Instead, he simply replied, "I know." Then, without looking back, he pushed the doors open and stepped into his freedom. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, reporters shouted, people scrambled for statements, but Jonathan didn't stop for any of them. Because this moment wasn't for them. It was for every person who had ever been wrongfully accused, every person who had been underestimated, every person who had been told to take a deal because fighting back isn't worth it. Jonathan had fought, and he had won, but not everyone gets that chance. That's the reality of a system that too often assumes guilt before innocence, a system that laughs in the face of those who dare to challenge it. But here's the truth. Intelligence is power. Knowledge is a weapon, and sometimes the only way to beat the system is to know it better than they do. If you've ever felt underestimated, dismissed, or backed into a corner, remember Jonathan Ellis, and remember that the best way to prove them wrong is to win.